But then let's imagine, what if we had a different data type? So this actually works. The equation actually works for objects that have simple data types. For example, these they have an integer and strings, so there's nothing else, there's nothing complex. But what if we get something like, I don't know, what if we get something like a date time, right? So required this dot created that. Let's make that date time, right? And we create the same time, right? Final now will be date time dot now, and we in here use now, right? We make that final, replace it with final, and now we hit run. So now we can see this failing because we have something that's not really equatable in the, it's not a simple Dart data type, right? So in this case, what Dart will do, let's go ahead and find the operator class. Yes, so over here we can see that how the equality method or the equality operator works in our Flutter project will be that by default all objects will return true if and only if that the first and the second objects are the same object. So basically, how computers store stuff, right, is when we create this variable, it takes this, goes to the computer's memory, and then goes to an address, maybe I don't know, maybe some address like this, and it saves it in there. It saves that value, this user in there, right? So this variable name, whenever we take this variable name, we're basically saying, so in turn, it actually stores the user's data. So it stores this, no, not that. It will store this in there, and then inside of this variable, it will store this address in there, the address's data in there. So whenever we do this, we're essentially giving Dart the address of this variable in the computer's memory. Alright, so that's, you can imagine it that way. So if that is the case, then whenever we do use one equal to user two, we're basically checking if they are pointing to the same object in the memory. Alright, so in cases such as these where we have non-constant objects, it uses what we call referential equality, meaning that it checks if they're referring to the same object in the computer's memory. If they're not, it will return false, as you can see over here. In order to make it use something called value equality by checking its values, we can then override the equality operator in our Flutter class. I don't know if I'm making sense. So, like I said, this isn't going to be totally beginner friendly. You should already have some grasp of Flutter. Then this is what we're talking about, right? So these two objects, we have to be able to know if an object is the same based on their values, not based on their reference in the computer's memory. In order to do that, we can override the bool operator, right? It has the double equals and it takes the other, right? So what this essentially means is whenever we call an object, any version of this object, for example, user one, and we add an double equal sign in front of it, and we put in another object on the right hand side of that equals operator. So in this case, user one, right, and we put in these right here, and then the other will be user two, right? This should return true if they're identical. So Dart has the identical function. It checks whether two object references are to the same object, right? So you can read through the documentation, but we can see here Dart values what is stored in variables or object references, right? So I told you what is stored inside of these variables are these the references to the objects, right? So let's go ahead and read. They can be multiple references to the same object. So even one object. So there could be cases where if we did user1 is equal to user1, and it could return us false. Wait, let me comment this out. And it could even still return us false because there's two different references to that same object. So there are cases like that. In this case, we don't have that here, right? So let me go ahead and change those out. Let's go back to reading what we were reading. So that could be the case. In this case, that's not the case because our case is pretty simple, right? So if an identical call returns true, it's guaranteed that there is no way to distinguish the two arguments. If it returns false, the arguments are not only known to not be the same object. All right, so this is the default way that Dart does it, referential equality. So we are checking if the object on the left hand side is equal to the object on the right hand side, which is the other, right? If that is true, then return true, right? If that is not true, then we go ahead and check if the other is the same object, if they're the same type, right? So if the other is also a user, so we check if the other is user, all right? So this is the start of a different check. This is how value equality works, right? So this is referential equality, and then now we're moving on to, so we check if they're referentially equal, right? If they're not referentially equal, then we check, or are they value equal? So let's go ahead and start with value equality. So we check first of all if they're the same, if the other is the same as the same type as what we have, right? So if it's the user and the other the runtime type is equal to this dot runtime type, right? So if their runtime type is the same and other dot, let's use the ID. So in this case, what we're essentially saying is right, check what is the problem, unnecessary disidentify it. So that's unnecessary. Yes. So what we're essentially saying is check if they're referring to the same object in the memory. If they're not, then go ahead and check if the second thingy, right, this is a user, right, which it is a user in this case, and also make sure that its runtime type is the same as my runtime type, the runtime type of the left value of the left operand. And then finally we check if their IDs are the same. So what this simply means is if all of these pass, return true if they have the same ID. So whether they have different names and different dates, so far as the ID is true, then it's the same person. All right, so we will see how that works. So now this also requires us to override the hash code. So after overriding this, you must override the hash code, right? So integer get hash code. You can go into the Flutter source code to see how they've done it. This is simply how they've done it, I think. So we can go ahead and say id.hashcode, right? So I'm using id.hashcode format. Yes, I'm using id.hashcode because the ID is the only thing that I'm using for an equation over here. All right, so over here now we can actually change this thingy to, I don't know, Deborah. We can change this to Lee, right? And we can do run. And we can see it returns true, even though they've got different names. But so far as their IDs are the same, it will work. Alright, so if we went ahead to also check if their names are the same, so we say don't only check if they're the same using their IDs, check if they're the same using their name as well. Right, so sorry. If name is equal to other.name, you could also make it if other.name is equal to name, whatever. I just prefer to have that convention. is equal to my name, right? And then over here, I can also add, with this, we add the superscript symbol, and we can say name.hashcode is the same as mine, and we can go ahead and do that. We can see it will return false this time because their names are not the same. So in order for two objects to be equal, for two user objects to be equal, we're essentially telling Dart to check if their IDs are the same, and if their names are the same. If any of these are not the same, then please return false. Alright, so we can go ahead and keep adding whatever properties. So usually for server data, servers cannot have two different datas. They're usually unique datas. Alright, so if you know anything about SQL, you know if they're unique. If you don't have any idea what I'm talking about, you can watch the other video. We used an SQL database in there, and I explained a little bit, I think a little bit of what it means. You can read up on SQL database, but basically these IDs are automatically generated by the database, and they cannot be repeated, alright, because they're unique, always unique, alright. So these can never be the same. So usually I'd use only the ID to check for my value equality. So even if their dates were different, right? Even if we created the first user, say now, final tomorrow will be date time dot. Do we have a tomorrow? I don't think we have tomorrow, so I'm just going to use now dot add. Sorry, dot add. I'm going to add a constant duration. Does duration have days? No, it doesn't. It has hours, right? Come on, mate. Don't tell me you don't have days. Because I know you do. Let's say 24 hours. Yes, so tomorrow is 24 hours. So, right, so let's go ahead and say run. We can see that they will still be the same user. Even though they were created differently, they have different names. But then since their IDs are the same, this will be true. If we change this to 2, it would change. Right, so in our tests in our application itself, we will be checking the equality of these things over and over. Now we don't have to worry about writing these over and over, right? Defining this stuff over and over in each class, right? So in order to make it easier, we already have a Flutter package called Equatable.